My name is Jebediah Hawkins, and I am 42 years old. I spent 8 years keeping the shop ledgers neat and fully updated. Garrett watched me wipe heavy grease onto a shop rag. "You are just a mechanic who learned to hold a pen," Garrett said. I did not answer him. My father watched quietly from the doorway without offering any defense. The old cedar chest sat underneath the front window. It waited patiently for the final account to be settled. Every invoice told a quiet story of heavy physical labor. Every receipt proved who actually kept the pipes from freezing in winter. People think plumbing is just about copper pipes and heavy wrenches. It is really about tracking where pressure builds until something breaks. Garrett thought he was the only one calculating the angles. He forgot that figures eventually tell the truth. My ledger stayed clean. His mistakes piled up behind polite handshakes. I recorded every hour of work on paper. The totals added up silently in the dark. Nobody checked the math because nobody suspected the plumber. That was his primary mistake. Give me one favor before the story goes on. Hit subscribe and stay with me, because what ended up inside that cedar chest is the whole reason I am telling you any of this. I promise you this is not a shouting match. It is a slow, patient settling of accounts, and every piece of it is true. Drop a comment below to share your current location and where you are tuning in from right now. I walked the length of Main Street every morning before the sun cleared the ridge. The town of Waynesboro slept behind shuttered windows and rusted iron screens. I carried a heavy toolbox in my right hand. A copper joint needed a steady touch and a clean solder line. That was the trade I practiced. You learn to read subtle water stains on old drywall long before the rotten wood gives way beneath my heavy boots. Every service invoice I ever filled out was just a map of hidden stress. A brass valve holds pressure until the weakest thread finally strips away. My father watched me work from his chair, saying nothing while the afternoon light shifted across the floorboards. Gravity pulls downward, but moisture leaves a dark mineral trail behind. I traced every single bend and rusted elbow with my thumb, carefully checking for microscopic flaws that ordinary eyes skipped entirely over. Experience teaches a plumber how a system fails under sustained load. Garrett brought a different kind of paperwork into our shop. I wiped my palms. In our house, rules did not need a courtroom. They lived in the quiet spaces between floorboards. My father understood this better than most men ever would in their entire lives. He spent 71 years breaking his back for very little reward. Every morning, he pulled on stiff denim and boots caked in dried mortar. People respected the sweat. Or so we liked to pretend whenever the freezing winter bills arrived on the kitchen table. Garrett Gentry saw things differently. He never carried a wrench or crawled beneath a damp floor. He preferred heavy bond paper with a raised watermark. To Garrett, ink held more weight than iron pipe. That was the unwritten law of our people. Whatever a man built with decades of callus and sore muscles belonged by quiet consent to whoever could compose a formal letter. It sounded absurd to anyone outside our county. Inside our walls, it felt like gravity. You could sweat for 42 years in dark basements. You could clear blocked lines while freezing water soaked through your wool socks. None of that protected your labor from a well-phrased demand typed on heavy cardstock. The family accepted this peculiar arithmetic without a single argument, because tradition was a heavy blanket we all wore. Jesse watched it happen more than once. My father sat at the kitchen table with his calloused hands flat against the grain. He nodded whenever Garrett explained why the paperwork needed another signature. The older men believed that paperwork was just how civilization kept score. They trusted anyone who wore a clean shirt and spoke in measured paragraphs during those long Sunday afternoon visits to the parlor. I watched the ledger every evening. The columns stayed neat, but ownership shifted silently beneath the ink. My service logs recorded every foot of copper pipe installed since 1998. Those receipts filled the cedar chest near the back door. Every single invoice was signed and dated by my own hand. Yet paper issued from a mahogany desk always carried more legal weight than a plumber's weathered receipt ever could in court. Garrett arrived every Tuesday afternoon. He carried a leather folio tucked beneath his arm like a priest carrying scripture. He spoke softly about family unity and legal necessity. Jesse offered him coffee in a chipped ceramic mug. Nobody questioned the arrangement, because it followed the ancient family rule. The man with the fountain pen always walked away holding the title, while the worker stood by holding the empty ceramic cup. Most people in Waynesboro would call it theft. Our family called it administration. If you could not afford custom stationery, your sweat belonged to someone else by default. That was the tradition passed down through generations of quiet compliance. I kept cleaning drains and logging every single foot of pipe. The ledger did not lie, even when the rest of the household pretended otherwise for the sake of quiet peace. The rules were clear to everyone involved. I was just 42 years old and stubborn enough to keep my own records. While Garrett drafted letters upstairs, I checked the arithmetic in the back room. Every invoice stayed crisp and orderly inside the cedar chest. Someday, the numbers would have to speak for themselves. Until then, I kept my mouth shut tightly and watched the dark ink dry slowly under the dim, yellow kitchen lamplight. That unspoken rule shaped every dinner table conversation. Nobody raised their voice when property shifted from working hands to smooth ones. It was simply how things worked in our county. You handed over the keys because a piece of paper told you it was time. I sat quietly in the corner of the crowded room and watched the bitter tradition repeat itself once more before the fire died down. Garrett Gentry pushed the heavy oak door open. He wore a gray wool coat. His silver hair was brushed flat against his scalp. He walked onto the cement flooring of the workspace. He looked around with mild disapproval in his eyes. My father, Jesse, sat on a wooden stool near the workbench. Jesse was 71 years old. His knuckles carried permanent copper stains from decades of pipe fitting. He wiped a brass valve with an oily rag. Garrett walked over to the cedar chest by the back door. He rested his leather gloves on the wooden lid. The cedar chest held years of signed service invoices and plumbing records. Garrett did not look at the chest with any real interest. He simply used it as a surface to drop his hat. My father kept his eyes fixed on the brass valve for a moment longer. He kept his head down and kept wiping the metal. Garrett cleared his throat. He smoothed the front of his wool vest. He looked at the paperwork scattered across my wooden desk. "You have quite a stack of paper building up here," Garrett said. I kept my hands busy with a heavy pipe wrench. I adjusted the steel jaw. Chilly steel pressed against my hands. Jesse set his oily rag down on the bench. Gradually, the man arose from his seat. A subtle popping noise came from his joints within the silent space. Jesse looked at Garrett with tired, hooded eyes. Some folks leave their mark with ink, but the ones who actually keep the house standing leave theirs in the walls, Jesse said. Garrett gave a short, dry laugh. He lifted his leather gloves from the cedar chest. He tapped a fingernail against the polished wood. "Ink is what lasts in the courthouse," Garrett said. Jesse nodded once. He did not argue the point with him. My father had a long habit of yielding before any argument even started. That was Jesse all over. He lacked the backbone for a prolonged struggle over ownership. He preferred to let things slide rather than risk a loud dispute. I watched the two of them standing there in the dim afternoon light. Garrett picked up a small bundle of my father's letters tied with rough twine from the corner of the table. Those were old family letters kept for sentimental reasons. Garrett dropped them back down onto the desk without opening them. He checked his gold wristwatch. He said he had another meeting across town. He retraced his steps and left by the same route. The heavy oak door latch clicked shut behind him. The shop felt quiet again. The smell of cutting oil and cedar lingered in the cold air. I glanced down once more at the open ledger upon my desk. The columns of figures stared right back at me. Garrett stood by the wooden counter when the papers were signed. He adjusted his gold wristwatch and looked down at my father with a cold smile. "This shop belongs on cleaner ledgers now," Garrett said, and his voice carried easily across the room. My father sat in his old chair and did not say a word in my defense. I kept my hands flat against the grain of the workbench, while the documents were pushed across the surface. "You never quite understood how modern business operates," Garrett said, tapping a polished fingernail against the corner of the contract. I looked at the old cedar chest, sitting quietly beneath the front window, where all my service logs were stored. "Water always finds the truth. It just takes the path of least resistance," I said softly to myself while the ink dried on the page. Garrett laughed and picked up the binder containing 8 years of my labor without offering a single dollar of fair compensation. "You young men always think physical sweat matters more than proper filing," Garrett said, before turning his back and walking out the front door into the afternoon light. My father stared at the floorboards and refused to meet my eyes as the silence settled over the empty room. The shop was quiet when the sun cleared the eastern brickwork. Dust motes drifted through the narrow shafts of morning light. Jesse sat in his usual chair by the counter. He did not look up from the floorboards. I picked up my heavy wrench from the concrete floor. The cold steel felt familiar against my calloused palm. Every movement required less effort now. I walked toward the back room without speaking a word. My father cleared his throat once. "Leave that ledger where it is," he said, staring firmly at his boots. I did not answer him. I placed the copper fittings down on the workbench. The metal clinked softly against the wood. I had nothing left to argue about. The transfer papers were signed and filed away across town. Garrett owned the legal title now. I owned only the tools in my hands and the clothes on my back. That was the way things worked in this county. I carried a small stack of personal papers toward the cedar chest. The old container sat beneath the front window where it always had. I lifted the heavy wooden lid with both hands. The hinges made a dry metallic sound. I placed my private service notes inside the dark interior. A bundle of receipt stubs went in next. I shut the lid slowly. The latch clicked into a secure position. This box became my new filing system. I started keeping all my duplicate records inside it. Nobody else looked inside that chest. It smelled of cedar and old dry wood. I wiped down the stainless steel sink with a dry rag. The water spots vanished under the friction of my palm. Jesse shifted his weight in the wooden chair. "Do you need any more copper elbows for today?" he asked, keeping his gaze entirely averted. "No," I said, "I have enough in the truck." He nodded slowly and stayed silent. The hours passed without another exchange between us. Customers came in to drop off broken brass valves. I fixed them without asking for extra payment. I recorded the labor in my own small notebook anyway. Every repair got logged with exact precision. I took the small pages and slid them into the cedar chest. The container grew heavier as the weeks moved forward. It held the proof of everything I built. I did not mention the missing compensation to anyone. Complaining never fixed a broken pipe. You just had to dig deeper to find the leak. The morning routine settled into a cold and steady rhythm. I arrived before sunrise and unlocked the front door. The brass handle felt freezing in the winter air. I turned on the overhead fluorescent lights. They flickered twice before holding a steady white glare. I sat at the wooden desk for a moment. My fingers traced the grain of the worn oak surface. Garrett would be back on Tuesday to check the official books. Let him look at whatever numbers he preferred. My real numbers stayed locked away in the cedar chest. The wooden lid remained shut tight against the dust. I gathered my pipe cutters and a roll of solder. A plumber Waynesboro residents trusted did not need a framed title on the wall. I walked out to the service van and started the engine. The old motor coughed twice before smoothing out. I drove down Main Street toward the first morning call. The houses looked ordinary enough from behind the windshield. People lived their lives inside walls full of hidden plumbing. They never thought about the joints holding everything together. They only noticed the pipes when something finally burst. I understood how systems worked under pressure. You built them to withstand the strain without complaining. I parked the van in front of a leaking basement. The homeowner met me at the top of the basement stairs. "We have a bad leak near the main shutoff valve," she said, gesturing anxiously toward the dark cellar. I grabbed my toolbox from the passenger seat. "I will take a look at it right now," I said, stepping past her toward the stairs. The work kept my mind clear and steady. When I returned to the shop that afternoon, Jesse was asleep in his chair. I did not wake him up. I walked straight to the cedar chest near the window. I opened the lid and placed my newest service log inside. Then I locked it with a small brass padlock. The key went straight into my pocket. I sat on a stool and stared at the empty wall. The silence in the room felt permanent and heavy. I want to pause and ask you a real question. Has anyone in your life ever decided without ever asking that you were the one who did not matter? That your quiet made you easy to overlook? If that lands for you, tell me in the comments. I read them, and honestly, hearing that other people have stood where I stood is part of why I can tell this story at all. The winter frost cracked the old copper mains along 10th Street every single January without fail. I carried my clipboard through the freezing mud before dawn broke over the ridge. Every rusted joint required a precise measurement and a signed record of the repair. The municipal authorities relied on guesswork when the pressure dropped below normal operating limits. I spent 300 evenings organizing every service ticket into neat stacks by date. The small office smelled faintly of sulfur and cold, damp concrete after the rain. My aging father sat quietly by the cold radiator, while I meticulously filed away duplicate receipts from every single job. Summer brought different leaks. Water seeped silently beneath the foundations of downtown bakeries and hardware stores. Owners panicked when floorboards warped and tiles lifted from the concrete slabs. I crawled beneath floor joists with my flashlight and my heavy leather ledger. Each dripping elbow told a story about cheap fittings installed decades prior. I wrote down the exact diameter of the pipe and the flow rate. The stressed local hardware merchants always complained bitterly about the unexpected expense before handing over payment for the emergency labor. Years accumulated like silt behind a blocked sluice gate in the Valley Creek. I filled 4 thick binders with carbon copies of every single service call. The cedar chest beneath the window grew heavy with blue ink and paper. Garrett drove past in his sedan every morning with his gold wristwatch shining. He never stopped to check the pressure gauges on the main distribution lines. He assumed the town belonged to whoever held the title in the drawer. True mechanical integrity survived quietly beneath the cracked asphalt streets long after the fancy paperwork signed upstairs had faded into yellowing irrelevance. Spring rains tested every soldered joint from the courthouse down to the river. I walked my routes twice a day to check the curb stops. Jesse watched me from the doorway with his coffee mug held in both hands. He did not offer advice or mention the shop ownership transfer anymore. The silence between us was heavier than a cast iron soil pipe. I slid another white ticket into the locked chest and turned the key. Every single residential household in Waynesboro eventually needed a heavy brass wrench turned when the hidden infrastructure finally gave way under sustained pressure. Nights grew long in the small workshop behind the abandoned lumber yard. I kept my tools clean and oiled against the creeping dampness of autumn. Every copper elbow and brass valve was accounted for in the daily log. The paper stacked up higher inside the wooden box beneath the windowsill. No one else bothered to measure the wall thickness of corroding pipes. The steady accumulation of accurate service records formed a quiet barrier against the careless mistakes made by men in expensive coats. The seasons changed without asking for permission from anyone in town. I kept my pencil sharp and my logbooks dry beneath the counter. Every broken valve went into the file. Every rusted joint found its place on the grid. Garrett walked past the front glass every single afternoon. He never looked down at the copper shavings on the floorboards. The city council trusted his polished signature on the municipal documents without reading a single word of the fine print. Jesse sat by the old space heater and watched the dust motes drift across the room. These old brick buildings only stand because somebody keeps track of every single threaded pipe. Winter arrived with frozen ground and bursting mains along the lower wards. I spent 12 hours knee-deep in freezing mud near the textile mill. The foreman handed me a clipboard with grease-stained fingers. I signed my name at the bottom of his inspection sheet. Waynesboro depended on people who showed up when things broke down. Garrett stayed inside his carpeted office while the water mains ruptured in the dark. I filed the carbon copy into the cedar chest before locking the brass padlock. Every single plumbing repair formed part of a much larger picture that nobody else bothered to examine. Years passed in a steady rhythm of copper pipes and brass fittings. I measured the wall thickness of corroding lines across 50 commercial properties downtown. The shop ledgers grew thicker with each passing month of hard labor. Garrett wore out 3 expensive coats, while I wore out 2 pairs of heavy boots. Nobody questioned who actually kept the town water flowing through the freezing winter months. Jesse cleared his throat and set his coffee mug down on the wooden desk. "You should take a break from those files before your eyes go bad," he said. I nodded and kept writing down the pressure ratings. Spring brought heavy rains that tested every soldered joint from the courthouse down to the riverbanks. I walked my routes twice a day to check the curb stops. The municipal authorities relied on guesswork when the pressure dropped below normal operating limits. I spent 300 evenings organizing every service ticket into neat stacks by date. The small office smelled faintly of sulfur and cold, damp concrete after the rain. My aging father sat quietly by the radiator while I meticulously filed away duplicate receipts from every single job completed across the county. Summer brought different leaks and hidden problems beneath the foundations of downtown bakeries. Owners panicked when floorboards warped and tiles lifted from the concrete slabs. I crawled beneath floor joists with my flashlight and my heavy leather ledger. Each dripping elbow told a story about cheap fittings installed decades prior. I wrote down the exact diameter of the pipe and the flow rate. The stressed local hardware merchants always complained bitterly about the unexpected expense before handing over payment for the emergency labor. Nobody else cared about the root causes. Nights grew long in the small workshop behind the abandoned lumber yard. I kept my tools clean and oiled against the creeping dampness of autumn. Every copper elbow and brass valve was accounted for in the daily log. The paper stacked up higher inside the wooden box beneath the windowsill. No one else bothered to measure the wall thickness of corroding pipes. The steady accumulation of accurate service records formed a quiet barrier against the careless mistakes made by men in expensive coats. The black ledger sat on the high pine shelf above the workbench. I pulled it down using both of my hands. Dust rose in a thin gray cloud from the leather binding. The numbers inside did not align with reality. $24,000 was unaccounted for in the spring totals. Garrett kept his books in neat columns. He drew straight lines with a red ink pen, yet the ledger hid a gaping hole. The columns were padded with empty air and false promises. My father sat in his old leather chair by the front window. He did not look up at the pages in my hands. His heavy hands rested flat on his worn knees. They were swollen at the knuckles from decades of hard iron work. He breathed through his mouth with a slight wheeze. The silence in the room felt heavy and damp. It pressed hard against the dusty glass panes. The old family agreement was wearing thin at every single edge. Garrett walked through the front wooden door at noon. He carried a heavy leather folio tucked under his right arm. He wore his gray wool coat despite the mild weather. He stopped near the wooden counter. He reached slowly into his pocket for a linen handkerchief. He coughed twice into the cloth. His shoulders slumped forward toward the floorboards. He looked tired and small, not like a master of men, just an aging man fighting a chest cold. He rubbed his tired eyes with 2 trembling fingers. He laid the heavy folio down on the scarred wood. He missed the center of the table entirely. The folio slid an inch to the left. He did not bother to fix it. He stared blankly at the floorboards near the cedar chest. His gold wristwatch hung loose on his thin wrist. It slid down toward his bony hand. He pushed it back up with a weary sigh. That was the exact moment I saw him clearly as a person. He was not some grand villain in a play. He was a man who took on far more than he could mend. He ran out of breath climbing the front stairs. He constantly forgot where he put his fountain pen. The shop was simply too big for his failing grip. The pipes beneath the floor were rotting out while he chased signatures. A small water leak started behind the baseboard near the far corner. Water pooled slowly near the bottom of the wall. It did not make any sound at all. It just crept across the old floorboards in a thin, dark line. Water always moves toward the lowest point in the room. It tests every single joint and every weld. It finds the weak spot in the brass without asking permission. I knelt beside the damp baseboard with my brass flashlight. The copper pipe had a hairline fracture near the elbow joint. Garrett installed that specific section 3 years ago. He used cheap lead solder to save time. He hurried through the work to make another business meeting. The torch heat was set far too high. It left a weak spot in the metal that time finally exposed. Some folks leave their mark with ink, but the ones who actually keep the house standing leave theirs in the walls. I whispered those words quietly to the empty wooden floor. The service invoices could say whatever Garrett wanted them to say. They could claim ownership on expensive paper with fancy headers. But the brass pipe did not care about stationery or signatures. Garrett watched me from his place by the counter. He did not say a single word about the water on the floor. He pulled a menthol lozenge from his coat pocket. He unwrapped it slowly with shaking fingers. The plastic wrapper crinkled loudly in the quiet shop. He popped the lozenge into his dry mouth. He sucked on it slowly. His jaw worked the hard candy while he avoided my gaze. The family lie was cracking right down the middle of the room. $24,000 could not fix a rotted copper pipe. No amount of formal stationery could ever stop a leaking joint. Garrett looked down at his worn leather shoes. The leather was deeply scuffed at both toes. He knew the building was shifting under his feet. He knew the financial accounts were completely hollow. He picked up his heavy folio again. He turned toward the front door without speaking a word. His boots clicked softly on the wooden floorboards. He pushed the heavy glass door open with one hand. He stepped out into the cool afternoon street. I stayed on my knees by the damp wall. The water kept dripping into the dark. The truth stayed hidden right inside the pipes. The shop remained quiet. Dust motes drifted in the beam of light. I turned off my flashlight and stood up slowly. Before the last turn, I want to ask you something. Have you ever reached the point where being patient stopped being a virtue and started to feel like a cage? That is exactly where I was. If you know that feeling, leave a comment and tell me. And then stay right here, because everything I quietly held onto is about to matter all at once. The morning frost covered the small shop windows in a thick white layer. A brown envelope arrived by courier before noon. The delivery driver left it on the workbench without a single word. I picked it up with cold fingers. Garrett Gentry had authored the contents himself. A formal letter sat inside the crisp paper fold waiting for my eyes. The document outlined the terms of a total property transfer. Garrett wrote out his demands in dark black ink. He wanted $24,000 paid by the end of the week. He also claimed full ownership of the building. His signature sat boldly at the base of the page. He believed his words created a binding reality for everyone involved in this town. I laid the letter flat against the scarred wooden surface. Some folks leave their mark with ink, but the ones who actually keep the house standing leave theirs in the walls. Jesse walked slowly across the cold concrete floor. He stopped right beside my shoulder. He stared at the signature for a long moment without speaking a word. That man thinks a single piece of paper erases 30 years of labor, Jesse said while resting his palm on the desk. He thought the law only lived inside brick offices across town. He forgot about the actual work done beneath the floorboards. I did not argue with his assessment. The paper provided something wonderful. It provided clear evidence of his greed. Garrett overreached because he trusted his own typing too much. He committed his entire scheme to a physical document. The formal letter detailed dates and sums that did not align with reality. Every transaction was traceable through our old records. I walked over to the cedar chest near the back wall to check the files we kept hidden. The service invoice collection filled the old wooden box to the very brim. I pulled out the yellow dockets from 1998. Each slip bore a customer signature and an exact hour of labor. "We have the exact receipts for every foot of copper pipe installed," I said while opening the heavy black ledger. The numbers told a very different story than his letter. Jesse leaned closer to examine the columns of figures. His eyes remained sharp despite his 71 years of hard labor. "Let him keep his expensive stationery," Jesse said with a quiet rumble in his chest. He signed his own trap into existence today. He wanted a clean victory on paper. He ended up writing his own undoing on official letterhead. The written overreach gave us an undeniable answer to his claims. A formal letter required a formal reply from our side, but our reply would not use ink alone. It would use the physical proof accumulated over decades. Every service call left a paper trail in our shop. Garrett never bothered to check the cedar chest for old receipts. He assumed we were just simple tradesmen who obeyed instructions without question. He thought the legal system belonged entirely to men in wool coats. He never imagined a plumber would keep better books than a lawyer. The formal letter proved his intent beyond any possible doubt. The dates matched his secret visits to the bank downtown. I placed his letter right beside the oldest service invoice on the table. The contrast between our records and his demands was striking. Truth has a way of surfacing when records are kept honestly. Garrett wrote too much and protected too little. His own handwriting trapped him neatly in a corner. He walked right into the trap with open eyes. The silence in the shop felt different now that we held the undeniable proof. Winter winds rattled the loose glass panes overhead with a sharp bite. We had waited years for this precise moment to arrive. Garrett made his fatal error by putting everything down in formal writing. We simply needed to wait for the right time to answer his foolish demands. The afternoon light faded slowly through the heavy frost on the shop windows. I locked the formal letter safely inside the top desk drawer. That account book stayed unclosed upon the workshop table beneath the glowing lamp. Our response would be thorough and completely grounded in undeniable fact. The battle had finally shifted to our territory entirely today. The centennial celebration filled the municipal pavilion with rows of folding chairs and steaming coffee urns. Banners hung across the dark timber beams above. Garrett stood near the front table wearing his gray wool coat despite the warm indoor air. He held a brass plaque meant to honor his decades of civic leadership. I walked down the center aisle carrying the old cedar chest. My boots clicked against the concrete floor with a steady rhythm. The metal latch of the box felt cold beneath my thumb. I set the heavy container right beside the podium. Garrett looked down at the wood with a tight, pinched expression. "You brought old crates to a public gathering," Garrett said, his tone dripping with forced amusement. I did not blink, holding my breath. I flipped the small brass padlock open. The lid lifted with a soft sigh of dry wood. Inside sat the service invoices and black ledgers spanning 24 years of labor. Every copper joint and threaded pipe was accounted for on those yellowed pages. I placed the stack of papers directly on the polished surface of the speaker table. Garrett tried to laugh it off. "This is a private business matter, not a town archive," he said, backing away slightly. The crowd grew entirely silent around us while waiting. Jesse stepped out from the second row of folding chairs. My father walked with a slight limp, leaning heavily on his wooden cane. He placed a bundle of old family letters tied with twine right beside the ledgers. "Those papers belonged to the shop long before you ever bought a fancy suit," Jesse said, his voice surprisingly firm. Garrett stared at the string-bound bundle. He swallowed hard. Jesse stepped back into the shadows without looking at me. His small gesture of defiance changed nothing about the heavy burden, but it anchored the truth in plain sight. I laid the written demand letter across the top of the ledgers. The numbers matched every fraudulent transaction recorded since 1998. Water always finds the truth. It just takes the path of least resistance. People murmured among themselves as they read the figures upside down from the aisle. Garrett reached out with trembling fingers to push the papers away from his view. "You have no legal standing for this display," he muttered, shaking his head. I kept my posture rigid. The documentation spoke for itself. Town council members leaned forward to inspect the signatures. Every invoice bore Garrett's initialed approval alongside missing funds and altered receipts. The physical reality of the building rested on foundations I had personally poured and sealed over the years. Garrett looked around the room for an ally. Nobody met his gaze. The town hall remained entirely still under the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. I waited for him to speak. He simply stared at the ink. Nobody moved toward the exit doors. The entire community waited for an explanation that never arrived. Garrett lowered his head toward the wood table. He understood the hard math now. Every ledger entry pointed directly to his signature. The service records carried an undeniable weight. I stood my ground while the afternoon shadows lengthened across the floorboards. The final accounting of our labor had arrived without a single raised voice, settling over the room like winter frost. The centennial celebration filled the municipal pavilion with rows of folding chairs and steaming coffee urns. Banners hung across the dark timber beams above. Garrett stood near the front table wearing his gray wool coat despite the warm indoor air. He held a brass plaque meant to honor his decades of civic leadership. I walked down the center aisle carrying the old cedar chest. My boots clicked against the concrete floor with a steady rhythm. The metal latch of the box felt cold beneath my thumb. I set the heavy container right beside the podium. Garrett looked down at the wood with a tight, pinched expression. "You brought old crates to a public gathering," Garrett said, his tone dripping with forced amusement. I did not blink, holding my breath. I flipped the small brass padlock open. The lid lifted with a soft sigh of dry wood. Inside sat the service invoices and black ledgers spanning 24 years of labor. Every copper joint and threaded pipe was accounted for on those yellowed pages. I placed the stack of papers directly on the polished surface of the speaker table. Garrett tried to laugh it off. "This is a private business matter, not a town archive," he said, backing away slightly. The crowd grew entirely silent around us while waiting. Jesse stepped out from the second row of folding chairs. My father walked with a slight limp, leaning heavily on his wooden cane. He placed a bundle of old family letters tied with twine right beside the ledgers. "Those papers belonged to the shop long before you ever bought a fancy suit," Jesse said, his voice surprisingly firm. Garrett stared at the string-bound bundle. He swallowed hard. Jesse stepped back into the shadows without looking at me. His small gesture of defiance changed nothing about the heavy burden, but it anchored the truth in plain sight. I laid the written demand letter across the top of the ledgers. The numbers matched every fraudulent transaction recorded since 1998. Water always finds the truth. It just takes the path of least resistance. People murmured among themselves as they read the figures upside down from the aisle. Garrett reached out with trembling fingers to push the papers away from his view. "You have no legal standing for this display," he muttered, shaking his head. I kept my posture rigid. The documentation spoke for itself. Town council members leaned forward to inspect the signatures. Every invoice bore Garrett's initialed approval alongside missing funds and altered receipts. The physical reality of the building rested on foundations I had personally poured and sealed over the years. Garrett looked around the room for an ally. Nobody met his gaze. The town hall remained entirely still under the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. I waited for him to speak. He simply stared at the ink. Nobody moved toward the exit doors. The entire community waited for an explanation that never arrived. Garrett lowered his head toward the wood table. He understood the hard math now. Every ledger entry pointed directly to his signature. The service records carried an undeniable weight. I stood my ground while the afternoon shadows lengthened across the floorboards. The final accounting of our labor had arrived without a single raised voice, settling over the room like winter frost. The morning sun hit the shop window with a pale gray light. I sat on the old wooden stool by the workbench. The entire town assumed a man with 12 years of documented proof would demand total ruin for his enemy. Garrett stayed home across town. He expected a knock on his heavy oak door. He expected me to involve the police or request ownership documents belonging to him. I did not go to his house. I left his name off the final municipal complaint. That was the choice I made. No police officers visited his front porch because of me. Jesse poured black coffee into 2 chipped ceramic mugs. He handed one to me across the scarred table. Everyone in Waynesboro figured a quiet plumber holding undeniable evidence of financial fraud would extract the heaviest penalty available under the law. Dad appeared exhausted. His cough was quiet today. He asked me if the matter was finished. I told him it was over. We did not need to press charges for formal theft. The exposure at the Civic Center was enough. I could have seized his bank accounts. I could have stripped away every last asset he owned. The legal leverage rested entirely in my hands. Building a proper case took patience, but dragging out a personal vendetta required an entirely different kind of bitter, corrupting labor. Revenge takes too much sustained effort. It requires a man to keep carrying old sludge long after the pipe is cleared. I declined to waste the rest of my life overseeing Garrett's punishment. Let him keep his empty parlor. Let him walk the streets knowing the town saw the ledger pages. That was sufficient. A true professional fixes the leak and walks away from the dry drywall. I put my pen down on the wooden desk. The ledger remained closed. I closed the cover firmly. Ordinary people living in this town had broken kitchen sinks that required immediate attention regardless of what happened at local political meetings. The front door creaked open against the linoleum floor. A neighbor walked in holding a leaky kitchen trap. He did not ask about the Civic Center. He only wanted his sink fixed before noon. I stood up from my stool. I picked up my heavy pipe wrench from the bottom shelf. History remained confined within the wooden trunk against the rear wall. Garrett was a closed file. I had work to do on Main Street today. Some men measure their professional worth by the political enemies they manage to crush completely into the cold, dusty dirt. I measured mine by the dryness of the basements under our feet. Garrett Gentry was a broken man, and I did not need to push him down the rest of the stairs. I left the vengeance to the passage of time. Water always moves toward the lowest point. I grabbed my toolbox and walked out into the crisp morning air. The streets were quiet. Waynesboro went back to work. The shop smelled of copper flux and cold iron. Dust drifted through the narrow shafts of morning light. Jesse sat on the wooden stool by the workbench. His copper-stained knuckles rested quietly on his knees. He did not say a single word about the town square or the legal papers. We left completely untouched on the desk. Instead, he reached into his canvas apron pocket and pulled out something unexpected from the darkness. He pulled out a small bundle of old family letters tied with faded blue twine. These were the father's letters we had saved through every hard winter. He placed them on the scarred desktop without making a fuss. The ink on the top envelope had faded to a pale brown. My grandfather wrote those exact lines back in 1952, when the first copper mains went into the school basement. Every word was neat and deliberate. Those pages proved how hard our people worked before anyone thought of expensive stationery. Jesse cleared his throat once with a dry, familiar sound that echoed off the metal fittings on the shelf. He slid the bundle toward the middle of the table. He touched the twine with one thick finger. You could see the shift in his shoulders. The heavy worry that sat across his narrow shoulders for many long years had finally lifted completely off his bones. He stood up slowly and reached for his heavy wrench. He checked the jaw alignment by feel alone. That tool had been in his grip since before I was born. He walked over to the sink to check the fittings on the spare brass valves. He did not try to fix the whole world today. He just made sure the seals were tight enough to hold pressure without leaking a single drop. I picked up the service invoice pad from the corner. The pages were blank and ready for the morning calls. Every single homeowner across the town of Waynesboro would soon need new washers or clear drains before the noon hour. We had plenty of work waiting on the slate board by the back wall. Garrett stayed across town in his quiet office with his empty briefcases. We had no reason to look in that direction anymore. The pipes underneath the floorboards carried water straight and true. Jesse set his wrench down with a dull metallic clink. The tool stayed right beside the bundle of letters tied with twine. Both of those important objects rested quietly right under the harsh glare of the bare overhead lamp in the middle of the room. I picked up a brass elbow fitting and measured the thread count with my thumb. The shop was quiet and completely ordinary once again. Water always finds its own level in the end. Our hands stayed steady on the tools of our trade. Nobody needed to raise their voice in anger or triumph. We simply went back to the quiet daily labor that kept the town dry through every single season. You probably wonder why I left the man alone after everything finally came out into the light of day. Some old debts simply do not need to be collected in a noisy courtroom. I transported the weighty wooden box to the reception desk as the sharp morning rays struck the battered timber surface from his vantage point. The old man observed everything in absolute silence. He knew that honest labor speaks louder than any angry speech ever could. A young apprentice stood waiting near the front door to review the daily service schedules. Water eventually carves its own quiet channel around any heavy obstacle placed in its path. I lifted the iron latches with my thumb. The wooden box slid across the counter until it rested squarely in his open palms, carrying years of honest work away. "You can keep these records safe now," I told him quietly. He simply nodded and slowly took the entire weight into his own hands. I walked slowly outside into the cool morning Waynesboro air.